Martin Luther King Jr. is likely the most celebrated and iconic figure of the civil rights movement.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Universally romanticized as a pacifist in the struggle for racial equality here in America.
For this day, we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s return to the National Mall.
I have a dream. Martin Luther King Jr.'s immortal words, delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, have inspired Americans of all backgrounds since they were spoken on that historic day in 1963.
I mean, he even has his own nationally observed holiday.
Of a man who campaigned for peaceful change, of a man who stood for human dignity, and certainly the fulfillment of individual excellence, of a man determined, committed, mind and heart, to march, to live, and to die for those ideals, America's ideals.
But is there more to Dr. King's story that goes untold? Or rather, are there blurry pieces to the puzzle that get brushed over in the American education system? Martin Luther King Jr. was born in the Jim Crow South in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. He grew up in a religious community and household, attending church frequently and participating in choir and piano. From a young age, King was an avid speaker, joining the debate team in high school and giving his first public speech his junior year, discussing how Black America still wears chains. In college, King worked in tobacco fields, where he was only paid $4 a day for his labor. Right before college, King recalls visiting the integrated North, where there was seemingly no discrimination. I find it interesting how he didn't see the discrimination, because with modern-day neoliberalism, the discrimination is baked into the system. It's invisible by design. In 1955, the famous Montgomery bus boycott took place, King's introduction to leading a protest for racial equality.
That was the day that we started a bus protest which literally electrified the nation.
And with the success of the boycott, making discrimination illegal on Montgomery buses, King received national recognition.
Because the Negro people aren't riding them. Because one woman, a seamstress, tired after a hard day's work, got fed up with her 40 years of living under Jim Crow. Because one woman said, "I have had enough." And suddenly, just like that, 50,000 voices answered, "Amen, sister, enough for us too."
In 1960, he was asked by Atlanta youth to participate in a sit-in protesting that year's presidential election. And after doing so, King was sentenced to 4 months of hard labor in the Georgia State Prison. In 1963, the March on Washington took place, where Martin Luther King gave his incredibly famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
Then the march from Selma to Montgomery took place, and nothing else happened. Then in 1968, King was assassinated for wanting peace, and nothing else happened. That's probably the extent of what you learned about Martin Luther King Jr. in the American education system, if not much, much less. At least for me, the only time I ever remember learning about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement at all was as early as elementary school. I was so clueless as to what was going on back then that when my teacher put on the "I Have a Dream" speech, I literally thought we were watching it live. And when I went to a speaking event on MLK weekend, I literally thought the person speaking was MLK, and we were live attending the "I Have a Dream" speech. When I finally did grow up and became conscious of the world, I don't remember a single time being taught about the civil rights movement. Sure, it was mentioned from time to time, but it was never a focus of the curriculum like European history was. Not only does the American education system just brush over the civil rights movement, but it does so at an incredibly early stage of education, a stage at which students are likely to lack a lot of critical thinking skills and thus not ask any pressing questions. Questions like, why was he assassinated? What did the FBI think of MLK? Where was George W. Bush during the Kennedy assassination? Who was Malcolm X? Is violence ever justified? What happened during the 3 years between the Selma March and King's assassination? You know, why was MLK assassinated? Well, Martin Luther King Jr. was the leading figure in a global movement for racial equality. A black man in a white supremacist country advocating for the rights of black people. You might assume that Dr. King was mercilessly targeted by a racist white man for advocating for the rights of black people. And if you do think that, you're not entirely incorrect. The man arrested and prosecuted for the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. was James Earl Ray. He had supposedly broken out of jail only a year or so before the assassination, and while casually fleeing national authorities, he drove to Memphis after hearing about King's planned visit and shot him outside of his motel room. Strangely, a man who owned a restaurant near where the assassination took place, who originally testified to being at said restaurant during the time of the assassination, publicly admitted in 1993 to being involved in the assassination. His story's a little bit fuzzy, and he claims that the assassination was orchestrated by the mafia and not the United States government. But nonetheless, the King family is certain that James Earl Ray did not kill Martin Luther King Jr. and is simply a scapegoat for the real killer. It's believed that Dr. King's assassination was an orchestrated attack put on by the United States government with help from the Memphis Police Department. Considering the FBI was tracking King's every move, as well as mailing him letters encouraging him to off himself, it's not that hard to believe. Frankly, it's almost harder not to believe.
King, in view of your low-grade, abnormal personal behavior, I will not dignify your name with either a Mr. or a Reverend or a Doctor. And your last name calls to mind only the type of king such as King Henry and his countless acts of adultery and immoral conduct lower than that of a beast. You are no clergyman and you know it. I repeat, you are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that. You could not believe in God and act as you do. You are finished. You will find on the record for all time your filthy, dirty, evil companions, male and female, giving expression with you to your hideous abnormalities.
You have just 34 days. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bare to the nation.
But why would the government try so hard to kill MLK? I mean, he was just a peace-loving guy who wanted to see white boys and girls holding hands with black boys and girls, right? Martin Luther King Jr. is such a mythical figure in modern American history that people today would likely be so shocked to see just how hated he was in the 60s.
MLK was the most hated man in America at the time of his assassination for a reason. The very enemies of the progress that he sought to advance habitually quote him today and call him a hero unironically. America loves MLK as an idea, but actually killed him because they hated the substance of his message.
He's celebrated today as such a force for good, universally praised for the most part.
I have a dream.
However, most modern liberals that praise MLK for the work he did in the 60s would have likely hated him back then. At the time of his assassination, King's disapproval rating amongst Americans was nearly 75%. I mean, just compare it to the modern perception of BLM. Before 2016, hardly any liberal would even dare to defend Black Lives Matter. They were seen as a black extremist group that advocated for violence, similarly to how the Black Panther Party was perceived in the 60s. Liberals only started opening up to Black Lives Matter when Donald Trump began bashing it in the 2016 election.
What about the Black Lives Matter movement? Will they be singled out as a provocateur in this terrible situation?
Well, you see them marching, and you see them on occasion, at least, I've seen it, where they're essentially calling death to the police, and that's not acceptable. Whether you like them or don't like them, that bill is not acceptable.
Our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. Innocent people have been savagely beaten, like the young man in Dallas, Texas, who was left dying on the street, or the woman in upstate New York, viciously attacked by dangerous thugs. New York's finest have been hit in the face with bricks.
Once you're in agreement with white supremacists, it's probably time to reconsider. So what was Martin Luther King Jr. saying that made him so hated? Because let me tell you, it wasn't just desegregation. At the time of Dr. King's assassination, he was leading a national movement called the Poor People's Campaign. The goal of this campaign was to achieve economic justice for all working class people in America. This was a clear shift in focus for Dr. King, from a critique of race in America to a critique of capitalism in America. Dr. King had noticed that from the success of the Civil Rights Movement and the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Black Americans had still not seen an improvement in their material condition, and they sought to correct this by making economic changes that would improve the lives of every American. The Poor People's Campaign sought to organize a march in Washington, D.C., and those marching would mostly be poor working class Americans, making themselves visible to the government and the country as a whole. For the very first time since pre-World War II, there was a mass movement underway in the United States that was not only anti-war, but also anti-capitalist. A year before his death in 1967, Dr. King spoke on Vietnam. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. As time went on, Martin Luther King Jr. was simply too good at not only organizing the American working class, but also opening their eyes to the injustices they face on a daily basis. In 1968, the year of his death, he said, "History has taught it is not enough for people to be angry. The supreme task is to organize and unite people so that their anger becomes a transforming force." Dr. King was killed before anything came of the Poor People's Campaign. But taking a look at the demands of the movement, it really makes you realize just how little we've done in this country since the death of Dr. King. Have a listen to these demands, and definitely don't acknowledge just how much you relate to each and every one of them. 1. A meaningful job at a living wage. 2. A secure and adequate income for all those unable to find or do a job. 3. Access to land for economic uses. 4. Access to capital for poor people and minorities to promote their own businesses. And 5. Ability for ordinary people to play a truly significant role in the government. Knowing what I know now, it's pretty clear why the government assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, they had to, if they wanted to continue the degeneration of capitalism in America. Martin Luther King Jr. was anti-racist. But what they don't tell you is in order to be anti-racist, you also have to be anti-capitalist. So when January 15th comes around, this one being King's 95th birthday, remember what he fought for. Remember his contributions. For injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Thank you for watching North Star Radio. Peace and love, and free Palestine.